Hello, we are back in business. This is going to be something new, and definitely for me, it is something new. I will do my best, and hopefully, you'll see some improvement in the videos that I will produce for you for the rest of the semester. We're going to slow down a little bit. We're going to do some review. We never finished Ohiyesa, so I'm going to review some of the stuff we did go over in class. There was a lot of absences, so many of you missed the beginning, the introduction to Ohiyesa, and so we're going to go over that again, and then we're going to do some things that we didn't get to. So we've got our Ohiyesa here, the presentation. That should look familiar. And now we're all on the screen together. You got my face, you've got the presentation, and I can put some notes up here in the upper right corner. Okay, so probably going to try to produce this in two separate videos. First, I'm going to go over an introduction to Ohiyesa, and then I'm going to make another video where we go through just some of what Ohiyesa wrote and how he gives us a virtue ethics, and it's a little bit different than Aristotle's virtue ethics. Okay, so here we have the triangle of ethics, which we get from Aristotle, and we remember that there's three angles here, and depending on where you start, what you make the foundation, what you prioritize in your principles, you're going to have a different ethical theory. So if you prioritize action, then you start with a deontology, and we've studied divine command theory so far. If you start with the consequences, the goals, the end, then what you have is either utilitarianism, and we said there was two kinds, act and rule, or an ethical egoism. And remember, we said that the difference between these is that utilitarianism has a principle of altruism, right? Everybody counts. So we need to do what is going to maximize the pleasure in the world for everybody. Whereas ethical egoism, the only consequences that matter or how things affect you. And the right thing to do is that which produces the most pleasure for yourself. So those were the first two ethical theories we studied. Now we're studying virtue ethics. And virtue ethics says, no, there's no rules. We can't just have one rule that applies all the time. Each situation is different. And virtue ethics also argues that we can't be just goal-oriented, and there's many arguments for that. One might be that we don't always know what our goals are, or we're never really sure what's going to happen when we do something. So virtue ethics says the most reliable way to navigate through life is just to think about character or person, and just to be a good person. If you're a good person, then you'll know what to do, and whatever happens, you will be able to live with it, right? Because you're just being a good person. Okay. Next slide. We have Ohiyesa. Ohiyesa is Native American, so we're going to have a Native American philosophy here. He's a very interesting figure, and so I want to try to give you an idea of his life, where he's coming from, his perspective. It all works into his ethics. So here it begins our journey with Ohiyesa. Sound effects. All right, Ohiyesa, and I believe it is pronounced Ohiyesa, and that is because I was on a Native American Museum's website, and they said that this is how it is pronounced. So I used to pronounce it differently until I had discovered that. Ohiyesa lives from 1858 to 1939. And let's see. Okay, so important thing to know about Ohiyesa is that he saw himself as living in two worlds at the same time. He lived in the world of the Native American, and at the same time, he considered himself to also be a new American. I'm trying to get this to be more centered. That's less centered. Okay. Should I go the other way? No, it doesn't seem to matter that much. Okay. So how is he living in two worlds at the same time? We're going to learn how. But it's important that we know that he truly considered himself both a Native American and to have become a part of the new America also. And that this living in two worlds gave him a perspective and an opportunity that others might not have if you only lived within one of these worlds. So he thought this was a unique position. All right. So when Ohiyesa was born, his name was not Ohiyesa. His first name, and this is cultural practice, his first name was Hakata, which means pitiful last. That's not a great name to have. And the reason why he was given that name is because his mom died soon after childbirth. So there would be no more children. He was the last child to be born from his mother. And he was kind of a tiny, scrawny infant. And so it was the pitiful last. He had 3 older brothers and 1 older sister. In the Native American culture, it's a virtue ethics. And so you show people who you are, what kind of person you are. And as a child, Ohiyesa showed who he was, and then at some point you are given a new name by the elders, and it's based on who you've shown yourself to be. And Ohiyesa's new name was Ohiyesa, which means winner. So he went from the pitiful last to winner, which is an incredible feat. And a story of someone who showed resilience and determination. Okay, Ohiyesa also had a Christian name, and that was Charles Alexander Eastman, and he used both names. The reason why he had this name is because his maternal grandfather, so on his mom's side, his mom's mom was married to a U.S. Army officer, Seth Eastman, who was stationed at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, which was near the reservation where the mother lived, the grandmother lived, and the grandmother's father was the chief. And the forts were built right by the reservations because the Native Americans were not very happy what had happened to them, being pushed onto these reservations. These were not the great lands. They were pushed onto areas that were subpar, and there was often uprisings. So the U.S. government built forts by the different reservations to try to control the Native Americans. And apparently many of the officers were interested in Native American culture, and some of them became friendly with the Native Americans. We don't really know what happened here, how this relationship started. It could have been absolutely horrible. Seth Eastman could have raped the Ohiyesa's grandmother, or it could have been a case where they truly developed a relationship. Seth Eastman was interested in Native American culture, Or it could have been the case that the father, as the chieftain, made an offering to the army of his daughter to try to gain favor. We just don't know. What we do know is that they were married but not in a church, and that they had one child, which would be Ohiyesa's mom. Okay, so Ohiyesa's born in 1858, and she dies soon after that, and 4 years later, there's an uprising. 4 years later is 1862, and this happens to be during the Civil War. Civil War is from 1861 to 1865. So Ohiyesa is 4 years old. There's this uprising. The reason why there was an uprising is because they're in Minnesota, sort of the North Territory, more sort of out northwest, and the Civil War battles are taking place in the South. And so many of the most seasoned soldiers are traveling down to support the Civil War, and the Native Americans say, hey, this might be an opportunity for us to reclaim some land. And so there is an uprising in 1862. The military is brought back, and the Sioux actually were doing quite well before reinforcements came in. When reinforcements came in, it was absolutely devastating, and many of these uprisings that happened, the response was disproportional. They really just massacred those who would uprise, and they did this to try to discourage future uprisings. So what happened? Many of the Native Americans in the Sioux uprising were killed, and many were captured. In fact, hundreds were captured, and it was going to be the largest mass execution of all these Native Americans that had dared to uprise during the Civil War. And the U.S. government didn't want to have to fight multiple fronts against multiple enemies, and so they really wanted to end the uprising in a strong way. So they decided they were going to build this huge platform, and you can see this is an actual painting of the platform, and they were going to hang everyone they caught. Let me show you the next slide. This is actually a painting of the uprising, and often painters would travel and didn't have cameras as much back then, and there was some photography, but it was not widespread, and it was not quick. But there were painters, and they would travel and sketch, and then afterwards paint out the scene. So this was a painting that was taken from following the Sioux. So let's see. Something amazing happened. So the president is Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln realizes that this uprising, in some ways, is justified. The Native Americans have been wronged, and so he decides that he's going to commute most of the sentences of execution. And it turns out that where is it? Maybe it's here. No. Maybe I left this. Well, I realize now I didn't mean to say he commuted anything. Just wanted to say right now that he is president. Okay. Good old Abe Lincoln. So, what I do want to say is that Ohiyesa's father never returns. He's assumed dead, as most people who did not return were assumed dead, and most of them were. So Ohiyesa no longer has his mother or his father. So he ends up coming into the care of his grandmother and his uncle. and they don't want to go on the reservation. They're done with that. They decide to go off to Canada, to the wilderness of Canada, to live traditional Native American life, a semi-nomadic lifestyle. So they move around a bit, and teepees. They live out in the wild. They study nature. Ohiyesa, as a child, learned how to fish and hunt and trap and track animals, and to become very sensitive to different things that happen, and how to harvest, when to harvest plants, and what plants are used for. He learns a lot about Native American medicine, and he has a very traditional youth. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to do a quick excursion. This is like a side excursion because his family is absolutely fascinating, and I want to tell you a little bit about the woman who raised him, his grandmother. So, let's see. So I already told you she's the daughter of a Sioux chief whose name was Cloudman, and she was married to Seth Eastman. When she was married to him, she was only 15 years old, right? And pretty immediately, she gave birth to a child. I don't know if she was pregnant before they were married or not. The marriage took place not in a church, but at a military wedding at the fort. And that's important. And you'll see why in a moment. Okay. So, a little bit about Seth Eastman. He wasn't just a soldier, he was also an artist. And he was involved in mapping out the West. As an artist, he was very good at sort of drawing and capturing a likeness of what was before him. So he was involved in map making for the military. He also painted, and actually he was a pretty famous painter. Some of his paintings still hang in museums today, and he has paintings that hang actually in Congress in Washington, D.C. The ones that hang in Congress are paintings of forts. After the Civil War, Congress decided they wanted a painting of every fort. So they sent Seth Eastman to travel to each fort in the country and paint it. And those paintings are still hanging somewhere in Congress. But he also was very interested in Native American life, and he did a lot of painting of Native American scenes. And here are some paintings here. Alright, so in 1833, so not that far after this marriage, Seth Eastman gets called back to Washington, D.C., and he just gets up and leaves. He leaves Ohiyesa's grandmother, his daughter, and he leaves his wife. He apparently, actually, this was not uncommon. It wasn't a marriage in the church. It was just a military wedding, and so they considered it to be a marriage of convenience and one they could leave whenever they felt like it. So he got up and left when he was called back to D.C., and boom, he's gone. Okay, while back in D.C., he meets someone new, Mary Henderson, and they I guess fall in love. Here's a picture of Eastman and Mary Henderson. She's from Virginia. She's from a wealthy family. They have big sort of estates down in Virginia, and they start a new life here. They actually have children. So that's kind of bad. Just goes off, leaves his first wife, and now he has a new one, new children. But it actually gets worse. The story gets worse. 8 years after coming back to D.C., he gets deployed back to Fort Snelling. Right, this is 1841, and he goes back. He brings his family with him, his wife and their kids. And his wife is now known as Mary Henderson Eastman. He goes back, and Louise's grandmother is still there, raising Louise's mother. Mary, this story keeps getting worse. So Mary is an author, and Seth is a painter, and they decide to collaborate on books, where Seth does paintings and she writes, and they decide to write a book about Native American legends and stories, and Mary writes the text, Seth makes all the pictures, and unfortunately in that book, and you can actually go and read that book, it's out there, they say some pretty horrible things about Seth's former wife, and much of the book sort of looks a little bit down on Native Americans as this primitive, foolish culture. So you can find some of Mary Henderson Eastman's books on Project Gutenberg, where books that are out of copyright are freely available. And they eventually leave Fort Snelling, and they I think go back to DC, but this is now closer to the Civil War. This is before the Civil War, and Mary Henderson Eastman writes this book called Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, and it's meant to be a response to another book. They're both published in the same year. But the first book is actually by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This one, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is much more famous than Mary Henderson Eastman's book, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. But actually, when they were first published, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin was successful. It sold. So why is she writing her own sort of response to Uncle Tom's Cabin? Well, unfortunately, she was pro-slavery, and Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that kind of showed all of America, in the North particularly, how horrible slavery is. And there's a couple things that came together for this to happen. Harriet Beecher Stowe loses a child, and she's devastated by this. And at the same time, she had an experience where she saw a slave auction, and she saw a mom see her child be sold at auction, and how this was just as horrible as losing your child to death, to lose your child to slavery. And she takes all her pain and grief from losing her own child and writes this story about the horrors of slavery. And Mary Henderson Eastman, who's from the South, who's from Virginia, who's from wealth, and who grew up with slavery and her family had slaves, writes this book, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, that tries to say slavery is not so bad, and people in the North don't know what it's really like, and so don't talk about it. And so she's trying to counter Uncle Tom's Cabin. What's pretty amazing is that Uncle Tom's Cabin causes people to rethink what kind of person they want to be in life, and it's considered to actually be one of the causes for the Civil War, because it finally awakened people to the horrors of slavery that they couldn't deny anymore. It was just so powerful to read this book, emotionally powerful. Remember, Aristotle writes about how emotions are what actually get us to do things. And this book touches us emotionally. The righteous indignation that you can't deny after reading this book motivated people to finally support ending slavery. And it's considered, if this book hadn't been written, who knows what would happen, but it's considered to be one of the factors that starts the Civil War, gets the support to end slavery. Okay, I'm not going to watch this video with you, but you can go and look at this video. It's from PBS, and they've done many programs on Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is sort of one of the previews of one of the shows they made, and it's kind of powerful because it shows it's a recreation, but it's a recreation of her actually, living her life. Okay, so Harriet Beecher Stowe teaches us that art can actually be quite powerful, and we never know when we create a piece of art how it might affect the world. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip this because we don't do this in this class, but there's, in ethics, freedom is really important, and it's really interesting that Ohiyesa has all these different sides to him in his heritage and his ancestors, from his U.S. soldier father, who's married to Mary Henderson, and they're fighting for slavery, to his Native American ancestors and their struggle to still be free. There's just all this going on. It's an incredible family history. Okay, so Ohiyesa grows up in the Canadian wilderness. He learns the ways of his Native American ancestors. He learns a life of virtue ethics, where what is important is who you are, what kind of person you are, what kind of honor you emulate. That's part of you, and that becomes most prized, right? Your honor and your character are what matter in this culture. And he's about to become an adult. When you become an adult, there's a ceremony, and after that ceremony, you are an adult and you have all the responsibilities of an adult. And it was at this point, when he took on those responsibilities, that he felt he would need to now restore the honor and dignity of his family. And that would mean avenging the unjust death of his father at the hands of the new Americans, right? Because the first Americans are the Native Americans. So these new Americans, he felt, had wronged his family, and he needed to restore honor to his family and his tribe. So he's getting ready, you could say, revenge, or to avenge. And something very surprising happens. Ohiyesa's father reappears. He's now 15 years old. He was 4 years old when his father disappeared. He shows up. It turns out that Abraham Lincoln had commuted his father's sentence, so he was not executed. And in fact, most of the people who were caught in the Sioux uprising had their sentences commuted. They still did hang over 30 Native Americans, and it was the largest mass execution by the U.S. government still to this day. Actually, here's all the numbers. So, of the 303, 264 were commuted by Lincoln, and that meant 39 of the prisoners were executed. And actually one of them was given a last-minute reprieve, so it was 38. Okay, if you want to read more about this historical event, I have here a web address. You can go read about this. So his dad is back, and his dad now wants to be with his son. Ohiyesa is completely confused. He was ready to go avenge and restore honor by waging war against the U.S. government. And now here's his father. And his father says, "Come live with me." He wants to bring his son back with him to the U.S., not to a reservation. Over these years, while in prison, his father has changed. And part of that was he served 12 years in this Iowa prison, and daily Christian missionaries would come into the prison to talk with the prisoners and to try to get them to become Christians. His father becomes a Christian, learns to read English, learns to read the Bible, and now wants his son to learn English and also to read the Bible. So he doesn't take them to a reservation, he takes them to a missionary community, and they live in houses, and there's a school there, and it's very strange for Ohiyesa. So he's taken from his grandmother, and now he lives with his father. These are very, very difficult years for Ohiyesa, and many times he wants to give up. It's really hard for him after always living outside, being able to move around, to have to sit in a chair and stare at a board and listen to someone talk to him. It was really hard. He fled multiple times, he quit many times, and each time his father came to him and convinced him to try again. So that's what he does, and over time it gets easier. He learns the language, he can read, he learns to write, he learns the religion of Christianity. And as time goes on, he does decide that he would like to also be a Christian. And for Ohiyesa, it's not one or the other. He lives in two worlds, and so he accepts Christianity, and he accepts Jesus as Christ. He gets baptized, and it becomes another part of who he is. He ends up finishing high school, and he earns a scholarship to go to college. He ends up going to Dartmouth College, and he finishes college and gets another scholarship to go on and he becomes a medical doctor studying at Boston University. So incredible story. An incredible story of I can't do it to I can do it. And it was not easy, but he in the end didn't give up. So very unique to have a Western trained doctor who also spoke Native American languages, and he gets hired by the government as a government physician, and he travels to different reservations to provide much needed care. And these reservations around the country were in just deplorable shape, and the Native Americans were people who practiced virtue ethics, and so what was most important was your pride, your honor, your character, and that had been taken away from them, and they'd been pushed off their land when their people, their wives were taken from them, from the men. Their children were sometimes taken from them, forced into schools. All these different aspects were destroyed for them, and as a people who character means everything, if that was gone, they many times were desperate There was also things that were introduced that just didn't exist in their culture, such as alcohol. And so alcoholism becomes a huge problem on reservations. It still is. And alcoholism is a vice, right? So these are things that get introduced by the new Americans, and it helps to destroy this culture. Okay. Ohiyesa also ends up marrying a white European wife. She was a poet, and she was also an activist who was trying to work towards better conditions for Native Americans. It was very difficult for Ohiyesa. He was constantly on the road, traveling, and eventually his marriage fell apart, and he never got an official divorce, but they separated and never lived together again. One of the hardest things that Ohiyesa had to experience was the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was also known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. This is December 29th of 1890. And there was a group of Native Americans. A military unit came in, wanted to disarm all the Native Americans. And when they were doing that, things went haywire. And the military unit had these Gatling guns, or something like a machine gun, and just gunned down. And approximately 300 people were killed, and about half of them were women and children. And there were still some who were alive, wounded. About 51, 4 of them men, 47 of them women and children. Some of those who died from their wounds eventually. And Ohiyesa, as this doctor who can speak the language, gets called in and has to care for these Native Americans who have been massacred. And it's very difficult. And throughout his life, he was in a difficult position where he was working for the federal government, and yet he was trying to help Native Americans. And many accused Ohiyesa of being a traitor to his people. How could he work at all with the federal government when this was how the Native Americans had been treated? And the fact that he embraced the culture too of the new Americans and converted to Christianity, and truly saw himself as both a new American and as a Native American all at the same time. So this was not an easy life. Ohiyesa's friends, many of them encouraged him, since he knew both cultures. He said, "You're in a great spot to write, to share the real Native American culture with the new Americans," because they didn't really understand it. And much of what they knew was from the movies that might be shown, or the plays that were shown, the stories, the books, and all of that sort of showed the Native American as this primitive, ignorant people that were savages, right? The Native Americans were considered the savages, and the new Americans, right? From the colonies to eventually the cowboys, they're trying to civilize America. And so eventually Ohiyesa is convinced, yes, maybe I should do that, and he starts to write these books where he's going to share Native American culture. He helped to co-found the Boy Scouts of America. He also worked with the YMCA to teach many of the Native American skills, because there was this sort of belief back then that people were being more and more disconnected from nature. And that had to do with the Industrial Revolution, where everybody's working in factories and we're just cutting down forests. and turning it into lumber. And we're grinding mountains down into powder so we can make bricks. And there's just huge amount of building. And with the Industrial Revolution, we could do so much more. We could build so much more. So he actually helped to co-found the Boy Scouts of America. And in 1902, he writes his first book, Indian Boyhood, and it's about his growing up in the Canadian wilderness after the Sioux Uprising. He goes on to write 11 books, and many of them are available for free online, and some of them are available on YouTube as audiobooks. So if you're interested, there's more to learn about his life, and this is a website that where you can learn more about Ohiyesa. He also still has relatives that are alive in the U.S. and this here is a link to a preview of a documentary that was made about him. For a while, the family was trying to make this, and they put up videos about it to try to raise money to make this documentary. But they did finally make it in 2018. It was a part of a PBS special, and I'm trying to get a copy of it, but I don't have a copy yet. But this here is about 9 minutes, and it's only a 57-minute show, but this is about 9 minutes of the sort of it's about Ohiyesa, but it's also about his ancestors trying to reconnect to his legacy. Okay, so this is going to be the end of the first part of Ohiyesa. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the reading, and our reading comes from one of his middle books. It's called The Soul of an Indian, and we'll discuss that next.